Because not unlike the progressive era, something that you're going to see in the 1960s is a whole host of movements, a whole series of movements that weren't always connected and sometimes worked at cross purposes with one another. This is very reminiscent or indicative of what we saw with the various groups of the progressive era, during the progressive era, who sort of had tunnel vision and each wanted what they wanted, but couldn't necessarily overarch and tie together. Black power represents a significant example of this in terms of the consciousness raising that you see within the African American community about the instilling of black pride, a sense of unity, a sense of dignity, a sense of worth in an ethnic heritage and ethnic past. But this was all part, in many ways, a subcomponent of a big trend that we see in numerous factions of cultural changes and tensions throughout this time period known as the 60s, as old values were being challenged by the baby boom generation, which was now in their adolescence to college ages, and was arguing that they needed to have more voice in decisions that were shaping their lives, to say that we really needed to be a small d democracy in many ways. And these were the ideas of the New Left, affluent liberal college students who in many ways were embracing more collectivist ideas, some quasi-Marxist ideas, some communal and cooperative ideas, and were stacked up against things they saw as being arbitrary, tyrannical, the military-industrial complex, the war in Vietnam, older social models and hegemonies that had left people disenfranchised or not counting or less than. And so the more radical elements of this would involve groups such as the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, which began to, at the local and the national level, start coordinating protests, mass protests of college students across the country for these reasons of wanting to disrupt the Vietnam War or disrupt inequality on campus, or throw in with the idea that it was hypocritical for Americans not to have equal rights for minorities, and all the injustices they were seeing where the great society was falling short and not delivering. As part of this, you had movements that were known as the teach-ins, where college professors and students would all sit and discuss the policy in the war and teach and explain these positions on the campuses at these protests, why they thought the war was wrong, the history and backstory behind it. And the most radical fringe of some of these groups, groups such as the Weathermen, were the kind of extreme end of SDS. They were going to advocate violence. They were going to destroy campus buildings that they could, destroy campus records, firebomb campus institutions, which they saw as being in collusion with the government and the state, the military-industrial complex, try to keep major corporations from doing research on their campuses, try to keep the armed services recruiters off their campuses, try to get things like their ROTC chapters disbanded instead of advancing militarism on their campuses, and pushing very largely against the war as being unjust and immoral for the same reasons that we'd seen Thoreau argue against the Mexican War. We'd seen Mahatma Gandhi argue that nonviolent protest was right against tyrannical evils, which tied them in also as Martin Luther King and his policies and activities as well. Women's liberation in this era is also a splintering out of this movement that we see. Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminine Mystique, is going to, make her commentary on a male-oriented society that said that women were delegated to jobs of, nurturing, caregiving, and housewifery. And it urged women to start a modern women's movement. And the outcome of that would be the establishment of the National Organization of Women, or NOW, which even today is still an active political organization that champions women's causes. The culmination of much of this will be beyond the 60s, but its seeds are here, so we'll start with it. The push for an amendment to the Constitution, the so-called Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. This amendment will, many women's organizations will seek this amendment to the Constitution. It'll get passed by Congress and proposed to the states, but it's going to need 38 votes to approve. It's never going to get there. It's going to get about 3 to 4 votes short and never get ratified and approved by missing it by just 3 states. Many argued against the ERA, and many women argued against it, saying that it could allow for women to be drafted in the military, it could require for husbands no longer provide for their families. That's going to be some of the backlash against these reforms, and I'm hinting at some backlashes that are going to come. And the reason why the hints make this seem a little disjointed is, at the same time that all these causes are being advanced, you have other interested groups in society that are passionately dedicated to preventing these causes from being advanced. Backlash of a reactionary or conservative countercultural movement that says we need to keep things as they are, and these changes are not desirable. Ultimately, in the terms of the counterculture or the hippie movement, it was a movement made up of an awful lot of white middle class young people who were disillusioned by the war in Vietnam, disillusioned by the frustrations they saw in the hypocrisy of American society, and American social inequality. And of course, the stereotypes is what they grew their hair long, they abused drugs and smoked LSD, or dropped acids, smoked pot, and listened to their music and wanted a society based on peace and love. The biggest contrast you see as part of this is going to be then the difference between Woodstock and Altamont as two major festivals of this era. The Woodstock Festival in 1969 was the first of these major mega rock concerts of the era, bringing together a lot of the protest music and also the social and socially conscious rock and roll music of the era that largely had a mass amount of people there, and it went off without a whole lot of incident. Altamont would be a concert in California that would be the next year, and in that concert you would see there the drug-induced haze of the 60s is going to sort of take over and dominate the hippie movement and ultimately destroy the hippie movement, and it was going to lead to a concert that ended with controversy, assaults, violence, disorder, beatings, and even a few murders at that concert that was supposed to be the second Woodstock. So the hippie movement will devolve out of its own turning inward on itself, out of dropping out to too much of a degree, and it will largely fragment and crumble as well. The so-called sexual revolution, or sexual movement that went along with the hippie movement, in many ways had its origins not just in the Griswold v. Connecticut case we saw, but what led up to that case, contraception in the form of the birth control pill, which was perfected in 1960, which gave women essentially the ability to have reproductive control over their own bodies. And this is going to start a great deal of the culture wars that you still see in our society today about what place intimacy and intercourse should have in our society. And it's going to lead to the standard bearers of the society of the 1960s saying that all moral standards seem to have gone by the boards. And this is a movement that's self-involved and hedonistic, and it's going to be destructive of the American moral fiber. But the axis around which this hippie movement revolved is sort of a blend between what we've seen in terms of some of the consciousness of Black Power and the Civil Rights Movement and their agenda, but its real central element in many ways was going to be the Vietnam conundrum, the conflict that's going to be, that defines the era, and it's the lens through which all these movements are seen, even to a certain extent civil rights. Civil rights has its own orbit somewhat because it predates Vietnam, but civil rights and Vietnam will come together in a nexus in which all these other movements will sort of be drawn in many ways. The initial concerns and priorities and escalations in Vietnam. As we talked about earlier, Dwight Eisenhower refused to commit American troops to Vietnam. John Kennedy was ultimately going to commit advisors and was probably in the process of making greater commitments at the time of his assassination. The initial concerns that involved the Vietnam issue were part of a far larger global process and consequence than we had seen. Even though we discussed the things with Kennedy, the things with Eisenhower, it goes back to foreign policy assumptions the American foreign policy establishment had held since the beginning of the Cold War, since the end of World War II. In that, we had already seen there was this bipolar world. In this bipolar world, you had the Soviet Union and the United States in this Cold War, this hopefully non-shooting Cold War with nuclear shooting, being carried out by brush fire wars on the perimeter and by nation states that they would support or work against in proxy. So you had proxy wars going on where instead of fighting one another, they were fighting through engaging with one another through different groups on the ground in different third world nations, wherever those nations might be. Tied in with this was the concept of the domino theory. If one region falls to communism, then it will infect or taint the entire region and all the dominoes will fall. Hence, then, if Vietnam falls to communism, to do so would then jeopardize all the rest of Southeast Asia in this battle, and that would jeopardize the model of containment the United States was working on. So as we had mentioned in our unit on the Eisenhower 50s, the French initially, as a colony, had Vietnam and were attempting to preserve that colony. The United States, because our number one foreign policy priority was containment and the Iron Curtain in Europe, went against some of its other ideas about anti-colonialism in order to try to foster Vietnam as a colony of the French to help develop and boost their economy as quickly as possible to get them back up on their feet after the carnage, the destruction of the Second World War, what it had done to France as a nation. So when the nationalist rebels of Vietnam decided to push for independence, the United States, by throwing in with the French, the establishment, wound up leaving these rebels the alternative then of seeking aid from the communists. So it's a mix of communism and nationalism the United States is misreading because of the communist monolith idea that all communists were saying, because of the domino theory that one fall is going to lead them all falling. We began unintentionally and even unintentionally misreading the situation. So when the French lose in Vietnam in 1954, Dien Bien Phu, and there's the Geneva Accords set up to try to set up Vietnam as one nation, have free elections. The United States decides to never really have those elections undertaken in the South because our fears that Ho Chi Minh, the sort of Vietnamese George Washington, the communist leader, would have won this election. And not wanting that, then we seek to divide, like the East-West Germany model, like the North and South Korea model. Let's have a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. The Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, for their part, then see that this problem, which had historically been a French problem, now is going to be an American problem, and they begin trying to subvert or destroy the South Vietnamese government in order to then take over the entire nation and unify the entire nation as a single state of Vietnam under their own Vietnamese rule. So these initial American concerns and priorities are running counter to the concerns and priorities of the Vietnamese in Vietnam. And so we begin seeing escalations. And these escalations are going to drive a domestic debate between the doves, or those who were going to argue that we had no business being in Vietnam, and the hawks who said it's important for us to make a stand against communism there because if we don't fight it there, someday we'll have to fight it in Kansas City or anywhere in the United States. So the Johnson administration winds up needing a pretext, a reason to try to escalate the conflict, or not to escalate it, but a reason to be able to deploy American troops to forcibly, in this war by proxy, prevent communist acquisition of the entire the entire nation of Vietnam. That reason comes through the Gulf of Tonkin incident. In the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in an unclear series of events, American naval vessels thought they were being fired on by the Vietnamese. Lyndon Johnson then had, not unlike what James K. Polk had with the war against Mexico in an earlier chapter, tying things together. Lyndon Johnson had an instantly drafted message ready to go to send to Congress that was going to allow him to essentially have commander-in-chief powers not in a time of war. It was going to authorize the president to take any measures necessary to repel an armed invasion of an armed attack on U.S. vessels and to prevent any further aggression. Lyndon Johnson, in his folksy way, said the thing he liked best about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that Congress passed, he said it was like Granny's nightshirt because it covered everything. This is going to be the ultimate manifestation of the Truman Doctrine blank check idea we'd seen at work. The president now, in a situation where Congress has never been declared war, has essentially been ceded or given commander-in-chief wartime powers in Southeast Asia. And as such, Johnson's going to begin escalating the war. And in so doing, we had talked many, many lessons ago about how, for England, the American Revolution was England's Vietnam. This is now America's American Revolution, with America playing the role of England, the Vietnamese playing the role of the American revolutionaries. The issue of, in this conflict, the more troops that were put into it, the more difficult it became to wage the war against, because the United States went in big and heavy against an irregular, guerrilla force. And as such, the challenges of this conflict meant that by every statistical measure, the United States could win. We could win any battle involving firepower, organized units, armed divisions. We wanted to fight in Vietnam the way we fought in France in 1944, a big unit war against a big unit opponent. Instead, we were fighting an irregular guerrilla force, lightly equipped, lightly armed, that melted away into the jungle and into the hinterlands anytime we tried to come to grips with them. So the Vietnamese were able to choose the time and place of contact and combat. They retained the initiative, and also they were swimming in a social sea of their own people. They knew the area, they achieved loyalties and alliances, and as a result, they were able to frustrate American attempts to sort of stabilize, in a non-communist sense, this region. William Westmoreland, a commanding general in Vietnam, was continually assuring the United States that we were winning the war by a statistical margin, the so-called body counts, and it should seem that we were winning, but we weren't. And Lyndon Johnson and his administration increasingly get what is called a credibility gap. The so-called credibility gap is they were saying we were winning when we weren't winning, and the real proof of this came with the 1968 Tet Offensive. In this Tet Offensive, the Vietnamese hit nearly every major installation in South Vietnam simultaneously. Now, this is 1968, after about 5, 6, 7 years of continuous American involvement in Vietnam, and the American foreign policy establishment and our politicians telling the American public, yes, we're winning, victory is just around the corner, there's light at the end of the tunnel, it's getting better, and then they could do this. Now, ultimately, Tet militarily was a disaster for the North Vietnamese. The United States and South Vietnamese forces were thrown back on their heels, were able to respond, and were able to essentially wipe out all organized North Vietnamese resistance in the South. It set back North Vietnamese militarily, it set them back a couple years. But what happened here is, in an unplanned consequence for North Vietnam, it turned American public opinion at home. The North Vietnamese won psychologically in terms of the way the American people felt about this war, because how can we be almost at the end of the tunnel when they've got the strength to do this attack? How can we be almost in conclusion of this war when this thing can be done? And it was increasingly coming out to the American public that the Johnson administration had no real plan to win the war. And there was no real concept of what victory would look like when victory came. As such, this war is going to cripple Johnson's presidency, cripple the Great Society, and in many ways put scars on the American social fabric, on the American body politic, that were deeper than any other scars except for those of a century earlier during the American Civil War. And this will set the stage for the extremely tumultuous political and domestic events of 1968 and usher in the age of Richard Nixon.